The air over Golgotha was thick, not merely with the oppressive Judean heat, but with a palpable weight. It was the weight of anticipation, of mockery, of sorrow, and of something else, something ancient and cosmic, holding its breath. Below the three crosses that clawed at the bruised sky, the city of Jerusalem hummed with the nervous energy of the Passover festival, a sound that barely reached this hill of execution. Here, the only sounds were the weeping of a few devoted followers, the callous rattling of dice from the soldiers, and the labored breathing of the three men condemned to die. At the center of it all was Jesus. His body, a canvas of human cruelty, hung limply, each breath a monumental struggle. Yet, even in this state of ultimate degradation, a strange and unsettling majesty clung to him. It was in the quiet dignity of his posture, the profound sorrow in his eyes that seemed to hold not his own pain, but the pain of the world itself. The hours had bled one into another, a slow-motion torment under a sun that had grown strangely dim, as if ashamed to witness the proceedings. Then it came, not a whisper, but a cry that tore through the suffocating atmosphere. It was a voice that held the thunder of Sinai and the intimacy of a final human farewell. "It is finished." The words did not simply fade into the air. They struck the very fabric of reality like a hammer against a great cosmic bell. For a single, eternal moment, everything stopped. The wind died. The soldiers froze, their dice mid-roll. The weeping ceased, choked by a sudden, inexplicable awe. It was in this sacred, terrifying silence that the final breath left his body, a gentle, almost imperceptible sigh, as if the universe itself was exhaling. And in that exact moment, the world broke. It was not a loud shattering, not at first. It was a subtle, deep groan, a vibration that seemed to emanate not from the ground, but from the bones of existence. Old Eleazar, a stonemason whose hands were as gnarled and weathered as the Jerusalem stone he had worked his entire life, felt it first. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, his heart a knot of confusion and grief for the teacher he had admired from afar. This tremor was unlike any he had ever known. It was not the violent, surface-level shaking of an earthquake. It was a low, resonant thrumming, as if a string on a colossal, unseen instrument had been plucked. The very foundation of the world seemed to be weeping. His eyes, clouded by age, darted to the ground. The dust at his feet danced in strange, swirling patterns. He looked towards the city, towards the Kidron Valley, where the ancient tombs of the patriarchs and prophets were carved into the hillside. For generations, they had been silent monuments to the past. Their heavy stone lids sealed by time and tradition, their occupants long since surrendered to dust and memory. But now they were not silent. A faint grinding sound, like teeth being set on edge, began to echo from the valley. It grew louder, a chorus of stone scraping against stone. People in the crowd turned, their faces masks of confusion and growing dread. The soldiers, hardened men accustomed to the horrors of battle, scrambled to their feet, their professional cynicism dissolving into primal fear. What was this new torment? Eleazar, his mason's soul attuned to the language of rock, understood before he could truly see. The seals were breaking. The monolithic stone discs, some weighing more than a ton, which had been rolled into place to guard the entrances to the tombs, began to vibrate. First, a hairline crack appeared on the tomb of a long-forgotten judge. Then another, on the sepulchre of a prophet whose words had been ignored centuries ago. The cracks spiderwebbed across the ancient facades, not from a force outside, but as if being pushed by an impossible pressure from within. With a series of deafening cracks that echoed like thunder, the great stones began to shift. Dust, dormant for ages, billowed out in thick, choking clouds, and then, one by one, the tombs were opened. Not blown apart, but deliberately, unnervingly pushed aside as if by an unseen, irresistible hand. The dark, gaping mouths of the sepulchres, which had for so long symbolized the finality of death, were now exposed to the sickly twilight. The crowd at Golgotha was paralyzed. A sea of frozen figures caught between the horror on the hill and the unfolding impossibility in the valley. A woman screamed, a thin, piercing sound that broke the spell. What emerged from the tombs was not what they feared. It was not the shambling, skeletal remains of horror, nor the vengeful wraiths of folklore. From the darkness of the first tomb stepped a figure. It was a man, his form solid and real, yet he seemed to be cloaked in a soft, internal luminescence. His burial shrouds were intact but clean. and his bearing was not that of one woken from a nightmare, but of one summoned to a great and solemn purpose. He did not look at the terrified crowd. His gaze was fixed on the holy city, his expression one of serene, unreadable gravitas. Then another figure emerged, and another. Men and women of faith, saints who had died with the promise of a Messiah on their lips, were now walking out of their graves. Eleazar felt his legs give way. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth to stifle a cry. One of the figures, an old woman with a posture of immense grace, turned her head slightly. For a fleeting second, her illuminated face seemed familiar. It was the face of Abigail, the prophetess from his grandfather's stories, a woman who had died 200 years ago, waiting for the consolation of Israel. She was not a ghost. She was solid, real, and imbued with a life that seemed more vibrant than his own. This was not an allegory. This was not a symbol. It was a literal, physical testimony. The ground had been broken, the tombs unsealed, and bodies that had lain inert for centuries had been returned to life. It was a declaration shouted from the realm of the dead into the world of the living. The unconquerable tyrant, death itself, had just been served a notice of its own eviction. The power, unleashed by that final whispered breath on the cross, was so immense that it had rippled backward through time, a spiritual earthquake that had shattered the very gates of the underworld. The bloodshed on Golgotha was not an ending. It was a key, unlocking prisons that had held humanity captive since the beginning of time. And as these silent, glowing figures began their slow, deliberate walk towards the gates of Jerusalem, the world held its breath, for it knew with a certainty that defied all logic that the revolution had only just begun. Among the soldiers who had gambled for the Galilean's seamless tunic was a legionary named Cassius. He was a man carved from the harsh realities of the empire, his face a roadmap of desert campaigns and street brawls from Alexandria to Gaul. For him, crucifixions were a grim but necessary part of maintaining order, a public display of Roman authority designed to crush the spirit of rebellion. He had overseen dozens, perhaps hundreds of them. They were all the same, a symphony of screams, curses, and desperate pleas that eventually faded into the silence of death. But this one was different. The Nazarene's silence was louder than any scream Cassius had ever heard. Now, as he stood frozen on the trembling ground, his professional detachment shattered into 1,000 pieces. His eyes were locked on the procession of luminous figures moving with impossible grace toward the city. His pragmatic Roman mind, trained in logistics, strategy, and the dismissal of provincial superstitions, was at war with his senses. It was a trick of the light, he told himself, a mass hallucination brought on by the unnatural gloom and the tension of the day. These people were seeing what they wanted to see, what their strange prophecies had conditioned them to expect. He gripped the pommel of his gladius, the familiar weight of the sword, a small anchor in a world that had suddenly come untethered from its moorings. But the ground beneath his feet refused to let him cling to his disbelief. The low, resonant thrumming that had unsettled Eleazar now swelled into a deep-throated roar. It was a sound that did not travel through the air but rose from the very marrow of the planet. The hill of Golgotha, a place of death, suddenly felt terrifyingly alive. The ground bucked violently, not with the rolling motion of a distant tremor, but with the sharp, angry jolts of something powerful and furious directly beneath them. Cassius, the veteran of countless battles, stumbled and fell to one knee, his practiced balance useless against the earth's own rebellion. The other soldiers cried out in alarm, scrambling for purchase on the heaving rock. The two crosses flanking Jesus's began to sway violently, the bodies of the thieves swinging like grotesque pendulums. Dust and pebbles rained down from the rocky outcrops above. It was as if the entire planet was convulsing in a seizure of agony. This was more than an earthquake. Cassius had felt tremors before in the east, but they were chaotic, indiscriminate forces of nature. This felt different. This felt personal. It was a focused, intelligent rage. Every shockwave seemed to be a syllable in a language of divine fury. The earth was not just shaking, it was screaming. It was protesting the act that had just been committed upon its surface. His gaze snapped toward a massive outcrop of limestone near the base of the hill, a geological feature that had stood there since before Jerusalem was even a city. It was a symbol of permanence, a silent witness to millennia of history. As he watched, a dark fissure appeared at its base. With a sound like a giant's bone breaking, the fissure shot upwards, racing to the top of the rock in a split second. The great stone, which had endured ages of sun and storm, split cleanly in two, its massive halves grinding apart and crashing to the ground with a deafening boom that sent shockwaves through the air. Other, smaller rocks all around the hill fractured and shattered, not crumbling into dust, but bursting apart as if from an internal pressure. A profound and terrifying thought pierced through Cassius's fear. The very stones of the earth were breaking in grief and protest. He risked a glance towards the small group of priests and Pharisees who lingered at a safe distance, their faces a mixture of fear and grim satisfaction. They had orchestrated this execution, their hearts as hard and unyielding as the stones they stood upon. And yet, while their stony hearts remained intact, the literal rocks of Judea were tearing themselves apart. Creation itself was demonstrating the repentance that man refused to show. The world was mourning its creator, even as his own people stood by. Historians would later record this event. The pagan chronicler Phlegon of Tralles would write of a great earthquake in Bithynia that occurred during an unnatural darkness, an event so significant it was remembered for generations. The shockwaves of this cosmic injustice were not confined to the small hill of Golgotha or even the land of Judea. They radiated outwards, a spiritual tsunami that rattled the foundations of the known world, a testament to the magnitude of the life that had just been extinguished. For Cassius, the world had been built on a simple premise. Rome was the ultimate power. Caesar was the ultimate authority. The legions were the ultimate force. Strength, order, and the cold, hard logic of the sword were the pillars of his reality. But what was the strength of a legion against a power that could command the dead to walk? What was the authority of Caesar compared to a force that could make the earth itself rebel? The pillars of his world were cracking, just like the rocks around him. The most violent shaking subsided, leaving behind a series of shuddering aftershocks. The air was thick with a haze of brown dust that muted the already faint light. The cries of the crowd had turned to whimpers of terror. The world was momentarily still again, but it was a new kind of stillness, the charged electric silence after a lightning strike. The first sign had been an impossible resurrection. The second, a terrestrial rebellion. A chain reaction had been triggered, a sequence of cosmic events that defied every law of nature and man. And as the dust began to settle, Cassius and the others found their eyes drawn, as if by an invisible thread, past the broken rocks and the empty tombs toward the heart of the city, toward the one place that represented the very center of this nation's faith, the great, imposing temple. Something told them that the voice of God had not yet finished speaking. Inside the hallowed courts of the Jerusalem temple, the world was a different place. Here, insulated from the gritty chaos of the city and the grim spectacle at Golgotha, a sacred and unyielding order prevailed. Priests in immaculate white linen moved with practiced solemn grace, their lives dictated by a rhythm of rituals that had been passed down for 1,000 years. The air was thick with the holy scent of burning incense, the low chanting of prayers, and the faint, coppery smell of sacrificial blood. It was a realm of profound sanctity, a fortress built of law and tradition to house the very presence of God on earth. Annas the Younger, son of the powerful former high priest, was overseeing the preparations for the evening sacrifice. He was a man steeped in privilege and piety, his faith as much a matter of political inheritance as it was of spiritual conviction. He saw the Nazarene Jesus, not as a Messiah, but as a dangerous disruption, a threat to the delicate balance of power they maintained with their Roman occupiers and, more importantly, a threat to the religious authority of the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin. His execution was, in Annas's mind, a necessary and righteous act to preserve the purity of their faith and the stability of their nation. He stood in the court of the priests, his back to the great looming edifice of the holy place. He could not see it, but he was acutely aware of what lay just beyond the golden doors, the veil. It was not merely a curtain, it was a colossal tapestry, woven from fine linen and threads of blue, purple, and scarlet. It was said to be as thick as a man's hand, so heavy that it required 300 priests to move it. Intricately embroidered upon its surface were cherubim, the celestial guardians, a constant, silent reminder of what it represented, the absolute, unbridgeable chasm between a holy God and sinful humanity. Behind that veil was the Holy of Holies, the most sacred space on the planet. It was an empty, silent cube of a room where the Ark of the Covenant had once rested, and where the very essence of Yahweh was believed to dwell. To enter that space unbidden meant instant death. Only the high priest could pass through the veil, and only once a year, on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, bearing the blood of a sacrificed bull to atone for the sins of the people. The veil was the ultimate symbol of separation. Its silent, imposing presence screamed a single, unyielding truth to every generation. You are not worthy. You cannot approach. As Annas gave a quiet instruction to a subordinate, the first tremor hit the temple. It was not the violent bucking felt at Golgotha, but a deep, rolling wave that traveled through the marble floors. The great bronze lavers of water sloshed, their contents spilling onto the pristine flagstones. The priests stumbled, their chants faltering. A palpable fear, an emotion utterly alien to this controlled environment, rippled through the court. Annas gripped the edge of a stone altar to steady himself, his knuckles white. An earthquake during the Passover festival? It was a terrible omen, but before the first tremor had even fully subsided, a sound came from within the holy place that made his blood run cold. It was not the crash of falling masonry or the clang of a toppled menorah. It was a tearing sound, a sharp, violent rip, like a giant sail being torn asunder in a hurricane. It was a sound that should have been impossible. The younger priests looked at each other in confusion and terror, but Annas and the other elders knew. There was only one thing inside the holy place that could make such a sound. He pushed past the stunned acolytes and ran, his heart hammering against his ribs. He threw open the great golden doors that led into the holy place. The air inside was cool and dim, illuminated only by the flickering light of the seven-branched golden lampstand. His eyes darted past the table of showbread, past the altar of incense, to the far end of the chamber, and he saw it. The veil was rent in two. A perfect, vertical tear ran from the very top of the massive curtain all the way to the bottom. The two halves hung limply, swaying slightly in a draft that should not exist. The tear was not frayed or ragged as if pulled apart by human hands from below. It was a clean, decisive split, originating from the unseen ceiling high above and ending precisely at the floor. It was a wound inflicted not by man but by God. Through the gaping wound in the curtain, Annas could see into the forbidden space, the Holy of Holies. For the first time in his life, his eyes and the eyes of the other priests who had crowded behind him looked upon the place where the presence of God dwelt. It was no longer hidden. It was exposed, unveiled, laid bare for all to see. The theological implications crashed down on Annas with the force of a physical blow. This was not just a damaged piece of fabric. This was a statement, a divine declaration. The act of tearing a garment in ancient Israel was a sign of profound grief or righteous indignation. What was God grieving? What had provoked his anger? But the message was deeper still. The barrier had been removed. The system that he and his forefathers had built their entire lives upon, a system of mediated access, of priestly intervention, of blood sacrifices and ritual purity, had just been rendered obsolete in a single supernatural moment. The ripping sound was the death knell of the old covenant. God himself had torn down the wall of separation. Annas felt a wave of nausea. He saw the terrified faces of the other priests reflected in the polished gold of the lampstand. Their role, their identity, their very purpose was tied to that curtain. They were the gatekeepers, the mediators. But if the way was now open, what need was there for a gatekeeper? The truth, terrible and liberating, began to dawn in the corners of his mind, a truth he desperately tried to suppress. That final cry from the Nazarene on the hill, "It is finished," had not been the gasp of a defeated man. It had been a declaration of victory. The perfect sacrifice had been made. The blood of the Lamb of God had been presented, not in this earthly temple, but in the heavenly sanctuary. And in response, God had torn the veil, announcing to the world that the way into his presence was now open to all who would come through the Son. The body of Christ, broken on the cross, was the true veil, and through his sacrifice the path to the Father was now a new and living way. Staring into the empty, exposed darkness of the Holy of Holies, Annas was not filled with awe, but with a profound, soul-shaking dread. His world, a world of rigid control and predictable religion, had been irrevocably shattered. A revolution was underway, not of swords and zealots, but of spirit and truth. And as the news of the torn veil began to spread like wildfire through the temple complex, A new kind of fear descended upon the religious leaders, the fear that the man they had just killed was not an end, but a beginning, and they had no idea what was coming next. While the foundations of the earth and the foundations of faith were being violently shaken, the ordinary life of Jerusalem tried stubbornly to continue. In the bustling upper market, a merchant named Reuben attempted to restore order to his stall. The earthquake had sent several clay jars of expensive Tyrian dye tumbling to the ground, staining the cobblestones a shocking purple. He cursed under his breath, not out of fear but out of pure pragmatic annoyance. The Passover crowd was a river of silver coins, and every moment spent cleaning was a moment of lost profit. He had heard the wild rumors spreading like a fever through the marketplace, whispers of the dead walking out of the Kidron tombs, of a supernatural event at the temple. He dismissed it all as Passover madness, the kind of hysterical folklore that always seemed to bubble up when the city was overflowing with pilgrims and zealots. He was a man of commerce, of tangible goods and calculated risks. He dealt in weights and measures, not prophecies and apparitions. As he swept the last of the clay shards into a pile, he noticed the light beginning to fail. He glanced up at the sky, irritated. It was only the 9th hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun should have been a blazing white furnace, its heat radiating off the pale Jerusalem stone. Instead, it was shrinking, dimming, as if a great unseen hand were slowly turning down a cosmic lamp. The brilliant blue of the sky was bleeding into a bruised, sickly purple. A strange, coppery twilight began to descend, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. It was not a natural eclipse. Reuben knew the rhythms of the heavens. Passover was always held during the full moon, a time when a solar eclipse was astronomically impossible. This was something else. This was a violation of celestial law. The sun was not being blocked. It was retreating, withdrawing its light from the world, as if it could no longer bear to look upon the scene below. The unnatural darkness was unsettling, but it was the silence that followed which was truly terrifying. It began subtly. The incessant bleating of the lambs and goats tethered for sale in the nearby livestock pens faltered and died out. The cooing of the doves in their wicker cages ceased. Then the birds that nested in the eaves of the market archways, which usually filled the air with their chirping, fell utterly silent. The entire animal kingdom seemed to have been struck dumb by a single unspoken command. Then the wave of silence washed over the people. The loud, boisterous haggling of 1,000 voices, the very lifeblood of the market, began to dwindle. Shouts became murmurs, murmurs became whispers. And then, the whispers themselves were swallowed by a profound and heavy quiet. It was as if a thick, sound-absorbing blanket had been dropped over the entire city. All that remained was the sound of shuffling feet and the rustle of clothing, but soon, even that stopped as people stood frozen in place, their faces turned upward to the dying sun. This was not the peaceful quiet of the early morning, nor the respectful silence of a synagogue at prayer. It was an active, oppressive silence. It was a presence. It had weight and texture, pressing in on the eardrums, making the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. In this void, every man and woman was suddenly, terrifyingly alone with their own thoughts. The noise of life, which served as a constant distraction from the soul's deeper anxieties, had been stripped away. For Reuben the merchant, it was maddening. Without the clamor of commerce, his mind was left bare. His concerns over spilled dye and lost profits evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The stories he had dismissed moments ago now came rushing back, no longer seeming like foolish fables. The executed Nazarene, he had heard the man teach once, near the sheep gate. He had spoken of light and darkness, of a kingdom not of this world. Reuben had scoffed then, eager to get back to his business. But now, as the darkness physically enveloped him and the silence of the heavens shouted louder than any sermon, a sliver of doubt pierced his cynical heart. The prophet Amos had written words that the priests sometimes chanted, words Reuben had always ignored. And on that day, declares the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. It was a prophecy of judgment, of divine mourning. The sky itself was dressing in sackcloth and ashes. Creation was responding to the tragedy at Golgotha with a unified voice of grief. The earth had groaned and broken. The temple's heart had been torn open, and now the heavens wept in shadows and silence. Nature, in its raw and honest way, was more attuned to the divine drama than the men who claimed to be its arbiters. It was a silent rebuke to the hardness of the human heart, a cosmic pause button pushed to force a moment of universal introspection. For 3 hours, this supernatural gloom and profound silence held the city of Jerusalem in its grip. It was a period of suspended animation, an interval where the world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a verdict. The silence was a crucible, burning away pretense and leaving only the raw essence of each soul. For some, it created fear. For others, confusion. But for a few, in that sacred, terrifying pause, the silence began to prepare the ground for something new to grow. It tilled the soil of the heart, making it ready for a seed of conviction. The world was being made to listen, and soon, out of that silence, a single human voice would rise to utter a truth that would change the world forever. Cassius remained on his knees at the foot of the cross, the dust and grit of the trembling hill clinging to his legionary armor. The unnatural darkness pressed down on him, and the profound silence felt heavier than his shield. He had been trained to be an instrument of order, a cog in the magnificent, brutal machine of the Roman Empire. Fear was a tool he used against others. It was not an emotion he was supposed to feel himself. Yet in this moment, a deep and primal terror had taken root in his soul. It was the fear of a man who suddenly realizes that the universe is governed by laws far more powerful and mysterious than the decrees of Caesar. He forced himself to look up at the central figure on the cross. The body of Jesus hung in the eerie twilight, no longer a spectacle of public shame, but a silhouette of profound and terrible significance. The universe itself seemed to revolve around this still, silent form. Cassius's mind, a whirlwind of confusion, began to replay the events of the day, not as a sequence of duties performed, but as a series of signs he had failed to comprehend. He remembered the man's trial before Pilate. While the religious leaders had been a storm of accusations and fury, the Nazarene had stood in an ocean of calm. He had spoken of truth with a quiet authority that had clearly unsettled the Roman governor. Cassius had dismissed it as the clever rhetoric of a charismatic madman. He remembered the scourging. He had overseen countless floggings, and men always broke. They screamed, they begged, they cursed the gods and their torturers. But this man, he had absorbed the blows of the flagrum with a resolve that was not human. He had whimpered in pain, yes, but he had not cursed. He had not pleaded. It was as if he were enduring it for a purpose that transcended the pain itself. He remembered the long, agonizing journey to Golgotha. He had seen the way Jesus looked at the weeping women of Jerusalem, not with self-pity, but with a deep, heartbreaking compassion for them. Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. Who says such a thing while being led to their own execution? And here, on the cross, the signs had only intensified. The sky-splitting prayer. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The promise of paradise to the repentant thief hanging beside him, the tender concern for his mother, entrusting her to his disciple, and his final cry-zone of profound, soul-wrenching agony, and the last, a shout of triumphant finality. It was not the death of a victim, it was the death of a warrior completing a mission. All these moments, these strange and unsettling pieces of the puzzle, now clicked into place, illuminated by the supernatural events that had followed. The ground shaking, the rocks bursting, the sun hiding its face, the dead rising from their tombs. These were not random occurrences, they were a response. They were the universe itself testifying to the identity of the man hanging on the cross. Cassius looked at his fellow soldiers. Their faces, usually masks of bored indifference or casual cruelty, were now pale with shock and fear. They were no longer guards overseeing an execution. They were terrified witnesses to an event that had torn a hole in their reality. They looked to him, their centurion, for an explanation, for an order, for some semblance of Roman control in a world that had spun into divine chaos. But Cassius had no orders to give. The authority had shifted. He was no longer the one in charge here. He felt an overwhelming compulsion, a force rising from the depths of his being that he could not and did not want to resist. The rigid discipline of his training, the cynicism of his profession, the pride of his Roman identity, all of it dissolved in a wave of terrifying, liberating awe. He pushed himself to his feet, his armor clattering in the heavy silence. He took a step closer to the cross, his gaze fixed on the peaceful, lifeless face of Jesus. The words came unbidden from his lips, not a shout, but a declaration spoken with the force of absolute conviction, a confession torn from the very core of his newly awakened soul. Truly, he said, his voice raspy and thick with emotion, yet carrying clearly in the still air. This man was the Son of God. The words hung in the darkness, a stark and stunning proclamation. It did not come from a disciple. It did not come from a follower or a prophet. It came from the mouth of a pagan soldier, a professional executioner, an agent of the very empire that had condemned him. In the heart of the enemy camp, at the moment of ultimate apparent defeat, the first human testimony to Christ's divine identity after his death was spoken. This was the ultimate paradox of the cross. The instrument designed by Rome to proclaim its power had become the very thing that declared its limits. The symbol of death and humiliation had become a throne of revelation. The sacrifice had not just atoned for the sins of the faithful. It had the power to break through the hardest of hearts, to reach the most unlikely of souls, to conquer the most resistant of minds. Cassius's confession was the first fruit of a harvest that would span the globe. It was the first echo of a truth that would resound through the centuries. It was the proof that the kingdom Jesus spoke of was not to be advanced by swords and armies, but by a love so powerful it could transform an executioner into a worshipper. He did not fully understand the theology. He did not know the prophecies, but he knew what he had seen. He had seen power in weakness, majesty in humiliation, and life in death. He, a man of violence, had stood at the epicenter of a spiritual war and had just witnessed the turning of the tide. And as he stood there, a converted centurion before the cross of his newfound king, he had no idea that the greatest battle was now being waged in a realm he could not see, in the very heart of the enemy's territory. While the physical world reeled from the celestial and terrestrial signs, a far more profound and silent conflict was unfolding in a realm beyond human sight. This was the true battlefield, the place where the war for the soul of humanity was to be won or lost. As the body of Jesus hung lifeless on the cross, his spirit, untethered from its mortal vessel, began a descent. It was not a fall into oblivion, but a purposeful, sovereign invasion into the very heart of darkness. For millennia, the realm of the dead Sheol, Hades, the great below, had been a place of silent, shadowy waiting. It was a vast grey kingdom where the souls of all who had died, both the righteous and the unrighteous, were gathered. The righteous, like the prophets and patriarchs, dwelled in a place of comfort known as Abraham's bosom, holding onto a fragile, ancient promise of a coming Redeemer. They were captives of hope, waiting for a deliverance that had been whispered about since the dawn of time. The rest of the realm was a place of gloom and regret, a repository of souls held under the undisputed dominion of death, the final, unyielding tyrant. The ruler of this domain, the great accuser, the shadow that had haunted humanity since the garden, felt a surge of triumphant glee. He had done it. He had masterminded the ultimate coup. He had used humanity's own envy, fear, and religious hypocrisy to kill the Son of God. He had turned the very people he came to save against him. The light of the world had been extinguished, and now his soul was descending into the one kingdom from which no one had ever returned with their own power. The accuser prepared to welcome his greatest prize, to parade the defeated son before the legions of darkness as the ultimate symbol of his victory. But the arrival of Jesus was not what he expected. There was no fanfare of demonic celebration, no cowering of a defeated soul. Instead, a light began to dawn in the deepest parts of Sheol, a light the realm had never known. It was not the fleeting light of a dying star, but the pure, uncreated light of holiness itself. It was a light that did not illuminate the shadows, but obliterated them. The Spirit of Christ descended not as a prisoner, but as a king storming a rebellious province. He was not a captive being dragged in chains, but a conquering general marching through the gates of a surrendered city. The powers and principalities of darkness, the spiritual entities that had reveled in humanity's downfall, recoiled from his presence. His very essence was anathema to them, a searing fire of purity that exposed their filth and shattered their authority. The accuser watched in horror as his meticulously constructed kingdom began to unravel. The power he wielded was built on three pillars: the guilt of sin, the accusation of the law, and the fear of death. At the cross, all three had been systematically dismantled. The sinless one had become sin, exhausting its penalty. The law had been fulfilled, its demands met, its condemning power nailed to the wood of the cross. And now death itself was being confronted by life incarnate. Jesus moved through the Shadowlands, not with a sword, but with the authority of his finished work. The Apostle Paul would later write that he disarmed the powers and authorities, making a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. This was that moment. He wasn't fighting them. He had already won. This was the victory lap. He stripped from them their robes of borrowed authority, their weapons of accusation, their claims over the souls of men. The accuser, who had spent millennia as the prosecutor of humanity, was now silenced, his legal case against God's people thrown out of the heavenly court, the decree of debt against them cancelled forever. Then Jesus turned his attention to the righteous dead. He moved toward that place of waiting, Abraham's bosom. A stir went through the assembled souls. Abraham, Moses, David, Isaiah, Daniel, all the saints of old who had died in faith, clinging to the promise of a Messiah, now saw the fulfillment of that promise before them. The Lamb of God, whose sacrifice had been foreshadowed by every lamb ever slain on a stone altar, had come to them. His voice, the same voice that had calmed the seas and commanded the demons, now echoed through the eternal corridors, not with a message of salvation to be earned, but of victory proclaimed. He preached to these spirits in prison, not the prison of punishment, but the prison of waiting. He announced that the price was paid, the ransom was complete, the long night of waiting was over, and he declared their emancipation. The gates of Hades, which had been designed to hold all of humanity, could not hold him, and therefore they could no longer hold those who belonged to him. As the apostle would later write, when he ascended on high, he took many captives. He was leading a grand exodus, not from Egypt, but from death itself. The hope of the ages was being realized. Death, the great king of terrors, accustomed to receiving all and releasing none, now faced a power it could not contain. For the first time it encountered a life so pure, so potent, so divine, that its cold grip was powerless. The presence of Jesus in its domain was like a fatal poison to its system. Its foundations began to crumble. Its dominion was broken. And in his moment of greatest apparent triumph, the accuser understood the horrifying truth. He had been tricked. The cross was not a masterpiece of his own making. It was a divine trap. He had been so focused on killing the Son that he never realized the Son had to die to conquer. By orchestrating the death of Christ, he had in fact signed his own death warrant. He had been outmaneuvered by a wisdom so profound and a love so deep that his own malicious intellect could not fathom it. The war was over, and as the conquering king prepared to lead the liberated captives out of the Shadowlands, the world above, unaware of the cosmic victory, was preparing for the quietest, most somber day in its history. As the last echoes of the cosmic upheaval faded, a new and different kind of silence settled over Jerusalem. The unnatural darkness had receded, but the late afternoon sun seemed weary, its light pale and lacking warmth. The body of Jesus was taken down from the cross. The nails, now instruments of a sacred history, were pulled from his flesh. The crown of thorns, a mockery that had become a diadem of sacrifice, was gently removed from his brow. His lifeless form, wrapped in clean linen by the quiet courage of Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, was carried to a new tomb, one carved out of rock in a nearby garden. A great stone, heavy and final, was rolled into place, sealing the entrance. And then there was nothing. The sun set and the Sabbath began, the day of rest. The seventh day, which God himself had blessed at the dawn of creation as a sign of his completed work. But this Sabbath was not a day of rest. It was a day of profound and suffocating emptiness. For the disciples and followers of Jesus, the world had not just been shaken, it had ended. They were scattered, hiding behind locked doors in the labyrinthine alleys of Jerusalem, their hearts hollowed out by grief and shattered by confusion. Peter, the rock, felt as though he had crumbled into sand. The sound of the rooster's crow still echoed in his soul, a relentless accusation of his own cowardice. He had promised to die for his Lord, yet he had denied even knowing him to a servant girl. The shame was a physical weight, pressing the air from his lungs. Mary Magdalene, who had been delivered from 7 demons and had followed Jesus with fierce devotion, sat in a darkened room, the image of the cross seared onto the back of her eyelids. She had stood at the foot of it, a steadfast witness to the bitter end, but her courage now felt like a hollow shell. The voice that had cast out her darkness and given her life meaning was silent, entombed behind a wall of cold stone. Her hope was buried with him. John, the beloved disciple, tried to comfort Mary, the mother of Jesus. But what words could possibly suffice? He had accepted the sacred charge from the cross, taking her into his care. But his own heart was an abyss of sorrow. He replayed Jesus' words in his mind, desperately searching for a lifeline. "In 3 days I will rise again." He had said it. He had promised. But how could faith survive in the face of such brutal, undeniable reality? The teacher who calmed storms, who raised Lazarus from the dead, was now himself dead, a victim of the very powers he had seemed to command. The sheer finality of the sealed tomb felt more real than any promise. This Sabbath was the great pause, the agonizing interval between the promise and its fulfillment. The sky was silent. The miracles had ceased. The voice of the Master was gone. Creation itself seemed to be holding its breath, trapped in a state of suspended animation. The earth had witnessed the crucifixion. Now it endured the burial. It was a day when doubt felt more rational than faith, when despair seemed the only logical response. But while the world of men was frozen in grief, the unseen realms were in a state of majestic, silent transition. The descent into the Shadowlands had been completed. The proclamation of victory had been made. The ancient captives had been liberated. Now, in the stillness of the tomb, a different kind of work was being done. It was the quiet work of gestation, the silent miracle that precedes the dawn. God often works in the hidden places, in the silence and the darkness, away from the clamoring attention of the world. He had formed the cosmos out of nothingness. He had knitted life together in the darkness of the womb. And now, in the darkness of a borrowed tomb, he was preparing the greatest miracle of all. The body of Jesus, though lifeless, was not subject to the corruption that claims all mortal flesh. It was the sacred vessel that had housed the fullness of God, and it was being held in a state of divine stasis, awaiting the moment of its glorious reconstitution. The silence of that Sabbath was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of intense, focused, divine activity. It was the calm before the storm of glory. This day teaches a profound and eternal lesson. There are times in every life when the promise seems to be buried, when heaven is silent and hope appears to be defeated. There are Sabbath days of the soul where all we can do is wait in the darkness, caught between the pain of what is and the uncertainty of what is to come. But just as on that Saturday 2,000 years ago, God is still at work. His silence is not indifference. His stillness is not inactivity. It is the prelude to resurrection. The religious leaders, however, were not resting. Their fear, ignited by the Nazarene's own words, "After 3 days I will rise," gnawed at them. They went to Pilate, their hypocrisy on full display, seeking help from the pagan governor they despised to secure the tomb of the man they had conspired to kill. They were worried his disciples might steal the body and claim a resurrection. A guard of elite Roman soldiers was dispatched. The great stone was officially sealed with a Roman insignia, a mark that to break was to defy the full might of the empire. They had done everything in their power to make the tomb secure. They had the authority of the Sanhedrin, the power of Rome, a guard of professional soldiers, and a seal of imperial law. They had sealed the tomb with stone and fear and human authority. They believed they had contained the problem. They had no idea that no tomb, no stone, no seal, and no army could ever contain the Lord of Life. The darkness of that Saturday was deep, but it was finite. The world did not know it. The disciples could not believe it, and the authorities refused to consider it. But the dawn was coming, and with it, a power that would not just roll the stone away, but would rewrite the laws of the universe forever. The night was at its deepest, a thick, inky blackness that clung to the hills around Jerusalem. The Roman soldiers of the tomb guard were creatures of this darkness, their polished helmets and spear tips catching the faint starlight. They were a squad of 4, led by a hardened Optio named Tertius. They had been assigned this duty tomb watch and considered it both absurd and demeaning. Guarding a dead man? It was a task for recruits, not seasoned legionaries. Still, orders were orders, and the Sanhedrin had paid a handsome bonus for their trouble. They stood their watch in shifts, their movements economical and disciplined. The garden was eerily quiet, the air cool and still. Tertius leaned against an ancient olive tree, his senses on high alert, not for grave robbers, but for the boredom that could dull a soldier's edge. He looked at the tomb. It was a dark maw in the rock face, its entrance blocked by the massive stone disc. The Roman seal, a thick cord of waxed rope impressed with Pilate's official signet, was stretched taut across the stone and the rock face, a clear and undeniable warning. It was secure. final. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet hummed. It was not the violent, angry shaking of the day before. This was different. It was a low, powerful, almost musical vibration, a feeling of immense energy building from deep within the earth. The air, which had been still, began to stir, swirling with a strange electricity that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. Before he could even shout a warning, a light bloomed from within the tomb. It was not the flickering yellow light of a torch. It was a brilliant, impossible white light, purer and more intense than the noonday sun, yet it did not hurt the eyes. It was a living light, pulsing with unimaginable power. It shone through the massive stone, transforming the solid rock into a translucent, glowing barrier. The soldiers could see the silhouette of the body within, not lying still, but infused with this radiant energy. Tertius and his men stumbled back, their professional training utterly useless in the face of such a terrifying, beautiful spectacle. Their swords felt like children's toys, their armor like paper. They were witnesses to a power that did not belong in their world. Then, with a speed that defied comprehension, a figure of dazzling light descended from the heavens. It was not an angel of paintings, with soft feathers and a gentle face. This was a being of pure, terrifying power, a warrior of God. His face was like a flash of lightning, and his garments were as white as freshly fallen snow on Mount Hermon. He did not land on the ground. He simply arrived. The celestial being moved toward the tomb. He did not touch the Roman seal. Its earthly authority was meaningless to him. He laid a single hand on the massive stone disc. The stone, which had taken several strong men to roll into place, moved aside as if it were a pebble. It rolled uphill against gravity, with a low rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the garden. The entrance to the tomb was now open. The soldiers were paralyzed, caught in the grip of a holy terror. Their hearts hammered in their chests, their limbs refusing to obey. They fell to the ground like dead men, their consciousness overwhelmed by a glory too profound for mortal senses to process. They did not faint from fear, but were struck down by a power so immense it short-circuited their very being. And from the darkness of the now open tomb, Jesus walked out. He was not a resuscitated corpse, nor a shadowy spirit. He was vibrantly, gloriously alive. His body still bore the wounds, the nail prints in his hands and feet, the gash in his side, but they were no longer marks of torture and defeat. They were emblems of victory, glowing with the same soft internal light that radiated from his entire being. This was a new kind of body, a resurrected body, the first fruits of a new creation. It was a body that had passed through death and had come out the other side, immortal and glorified, unbound by the laws of physics and decay. He stood for a moment in the cool morning air, the first hints of dawn beginning to streak the eastern sky. He took a breath, not of necessity but of proclamation, the first breath of a new world. The silence of the tomb had been broken not by a sound, but by the undeniable presence of life itself. He gave a silent nod to the angelic guard, who now sat calmly on the stone he had moved, his very presence a divine statement. Then Jesus simply vanished from the garden, not walking away but stepping outside the normal constraints of space and time. Moments later, as the first rays of the sun gilded the olive leaves, the soldiers began to stir. Tertius pushed himself up, his body trembling, his mind a chaotic whirl. The tomb was open, the seal was broken, the body was gone. The celestial being was still there, sitting on the stone as if on a throne, his serene and powerful gaze fixed on them. Panic, raw and absolute, seized them. They scrambled to their feet and fled, leaving their spears and shields behind. They ran, not to their barracks, but straight to the chief priests, their terror overriding all military protocol. They burst into the chambers of Caiaphas, babbling their impossible story of the earthquake. The light, the angel-like lightning, the stone rolled away by a divine hand. The priests listened, their faces growing pale with a dread far deeper than the soldiers. Their worst fear had been realized, but in a way they could never have imagined. It wasn't a stolen body, it was a divine intervention. Their carefully constructed narrative was collapsing, but pride and power do not surrender easily. Caiaphas and the others quickly devised a new plan, a lie to smother the truth. They gave the soldiers a large sum of money, a bribe to purchase their silence and their complicity. Tell everyone, they instructed, that his disciples came during the night and stole him away while you were asleep. It was a weak, Desperate lie. A trained Roman guard falling asleep on duty was punishable by death. To admit to it was unthinkable. But the priests promised to use their influence with Pilate to protect them. The soldiers, caught between the terror of the divine and the pragmatism of survival, took the money. They chose the lie. And so, as the sun rose higher over Jerusalem, two stories began to spread. One, a whispered, frantic lie paid for with silver, a story of a stolen body. The other, the earth-shattering truth, was about to be discovered by a few heartbroken women who were making their way to a garden tomb, carrying spices to anoint a body that was no longer there. The age of rumor had begun, but the age of resurrection had dawned. While the soldiers were spreading their purchased lies and the priests were desperately trying to patch the holes in their crumbling authority, a different kind of procession was making its way through the awakening streets of Jerusalem. It was a small group of women, their hearts heavy with a grief that the new dawn could not dispel. Mary Magdalene led the way, her steps purposeful despite the sorrow that clouded her vision. With her were Mary, the mother of James, Salome, and a few others. They clutched jars of myrrh and aloes, expensive spices they had prepared after the Sabbath had ended. Their mission was a final act of love and devotion. Jewish burial customs required a hasty interment, especially before a festival day. They were going to the tomb to properly anoint the body of their Lord, to give him the last rites of dignity that had been denied him in the chaos of his execution. It was a hopeless, heartbreaking task, a ritual of closure for a story that had ended in tragedy. As they walked, their conversation was filled with practical, sorrowful concerns. "Who will roll the stone away for us from the entrance of the tomb?" Salome asked, her voice trembling. The question hung in the cool morning air. They all knew the stone was immense, far too heavy for them to move. They were driven by love, but their path was blocked by an obstacle they had no power to overcome, a perfect metaphor for the despair that had sealed their hearts. They arrived at the garden as the sun was climbing over the Mount of Olives, its golden rays filtering through the leaves. The air was sweet, with the scent of dew and blossoms. They walked up the slight incline towards the rock-hewn sepulchre, their eyes downcast, preparing themselves for the grim task ahead. It was Mary Magdalene who saw it first. She stopped dead in her tracks, a soft gasp escaping her lips. The other women looked up, following her stunned gaze. The stone was gone. It hadn't just been shifted. It had been rolled completely away, resting at a distance from the tomb's entrance, as if it were a trivial thing. The dark, gaping maw of the tomb, which should have been sealed and guarded, was open and exposed. Their first thought was not resurrection. That was a concept too vast, too miraculous for their grief-stricken minds to grasp. Their first thought was desecration, robbery, an unspeakable violation. Someone had come in the night, broken the seal and stolen the body of their Lord. The final indignity, panic and a fresh wave of grief washed over them. Mary Magdalene, her love and anguish propelling her, broke away from the group and began to run. She didn't go to the tomb. She ran back towards the city, her mind racing. She had to tell Peter. She had to tell John. They had to know. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. The words formed in her mind, a frantic, breathless message. The other women, more hesitant but equally distressed, crept closer to the open sepulchre. Peering into the shadows, they saw something that made them freeze. Inside the small, rock-carved chamber where the body of Jesus should have been lying on a stone slab, sat two figures. They were not grave robbers. They were men, clothed in robes of dazzling white that seemed to shimmer with an internal light. One sat at the head of the burial slab, the other at the foot. The women recoiled in terror, bowing their faces to the ground, overwhelmed by the aura of holiness that radiated from the beings. "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" one of the angels asked, his voice not a rebuke, but a gentle, resonant question that cut through their fear. "He is not here, he has risen." The words were impossible, yet they were spoken with the calm authority of absolute truth. "Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee?" The other angel continued, his voice kind, jogging their memories. "That the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." And suddenly they remembered. In the fog of their sorrow, they had forgotten his promises. The words that had seemed so cryptic and strange when he first spoke them now blazed with a new, brilliant clarity. This wasn't a tragedy, it was a fulfillment. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the explosive, world-altering climax. A joy so fierce and potent it was almost painful began to displace their grief. Tears still streamed down their faces, but they were no longer tears of sorrow. They were tears of wonder, of relief, of overwhelming, incomprehensible joy. They turned and fled from the tomb, not in terror now, but in a breathless, ecstatic haste. They were the first evangelists, the first bearers of the good news, entrusted with the most important message in human history. Meanwhile, Mary Magdalene had found Peter and John. Her frantic, tearful report sent them running towards the garden. John, being younger, outran Peter, arriving at the tomb first. He stooped down, looked in, and saw the linen grave clothes lying neatly folded. But he hesitated, a mixture of awe and fear holding him at the threshold. Peter, impetuous as ever, arrived moments later and pushed past him, entering the tomb without a second thought. He saw the scene clearly. The linen wrappings lying by themselves, and the separate cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head, not discarded haphazardly, but neatly folded and placed to one side. This small detail struck John with the force of a revelation. A grave robber, working in haste and darkness, would never have taken the time to unwrap the body and neatly fold the cloths. This was not the scene of a theft. This was the scene of an orderly, deliberate departure. The Lord had unwrapped himself, folding his grave clothes like a man folding his garments after a night's rest before stepping out into a new day. John then entered the tomb himself. He saw and he believed. The seed of faith, dormant during the dark Sabbath of the soul, now burst into full bloom. He did not yet understand the full theological depth of the scriptures, but he understood the glorious, undeniable fact. His Lord was alive. They left the tomb and returned to the others, their minds reeling with the implications. But Mary Magdalene, who had followed them back to the garden, remained. Her heart was still a storm of confusion and grief. While the men had seen and believed, she had only seen an empty tomb. She stood outside, weeping, her world still broken. It was in this moment of profound personal sorrow, when all hope seemed lost, that she would become the first person to witness with her own eyes the risen Christ. The greatest revelation was reserved not for the wisest or the strongest, but for the one whose heart was most broken and whose love was most persistent. The sun was higher now, its warmth doing little to soothe the chill in Mary's soul. Peter and John had gone, their minds ablaze with a nascent, world-changing belief. But Mary lingered, rooted to the spot by a love that could not accept the emptiness. For her, the absence of his body was not a sign of victory, but the final cruel twist in a saga of loss. She wept, not with the quiet tears of resignation, but with the heaving, body-shaking sobs of a shattered heart. Drawn by an impulse she didn't understand, she stooped one last time to look into the tomb, her vision blurred by tears. The two angels were still there, seated on the stone slab like sentinels of a new world. Their presence no longer terrified her. Her grief was so immense it had consumed all other emotions. "Woman, why are you weeping?" one of them asked. The question was gentle, yet it pierced her. "They have taken my Lord away," she choked out, the words torn from her, "and I don't know where they have put him." Her reality was still confined to the logic of men theft, displacement, loss. The divine possibility was still just beyond her grasp. As she turned away, her sorrow pulling her back into herself, she became aware of someone standing behind her in the garden. She did not see him clearly through her tear-filled eyes. She assumed it was the gardener, perhaps come to investigate the commotion. He spoke to her, his voice imbued with a quiet authority that was both familiar and strange. "Woman, why are you weeping? Who is it you are looking for?" The question cut even deeper. Who was she looking for? She was looking for everything. Her hope, her purpose, her savior, her friend. Thinking him the gardener, and hoping he might have some information, she replied with desperate haste, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." It was a bold, impossible promise born of pure devotion. She, a lone woman, would carry away a full-grown man's body, if only she knew where it was. The man in the garden paused. He looked at her, seeing not just her sorrow, but the depths of her unwavering love. And then, he spoke a single word, a word that held all the intimacy and recognition of their shared history, a word that was both a name and a key. Mary. The sound of it detonated in her soul. It was his voice, the voice that had commanded demons, healed the sick, and taught the multitudes. the voice that had called her by name and given her a new life. It was a voice she knew better than her own heartbeat. She spun around, her eyes instantly clearing, and she saw him. It was not the gardener. It was Jesus. He was standing before her, not as a ghost or a vision, but as real and solid as the ground beneath her feet. He was alive. The full, staggering, impossible, glorious truth crashed into her, and in that instant her entire universe was remade. "Rabboni," she cried out, the Aramaic word for teacher, imbued with all the love, worship and shock her heart could contain. She reached for him, an instinctive gesture to hold on to the reality she had so feared was lost forever. "Do not cling to me," he said gently, not as a rebuke, but as an instruction for a new reality. "For I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." The message was profound. The relationship had shifted. Before, he had been their master and they his disciples. Now he called them his brothers. Through his sacrifice and resurrection, his Father had become their Father, his God, their God. The separation was not just mended, it had been transformed into an unbreakable bond of family. He was commissioning her, the one who had wept in despair, to be the apostle to the apostles, the first to proclaim the living Christ. And so Mary ran, but this time she ran not with the panic of loss, but with the explosive power of revelation. She burst in on the disciples, who were still huddled behind their locked doors, mourning and weeping. "I have seen the Lord," she exclaimed, her face radiant, her voice ringing with a joy that defied their sorrow. And she told them everything he had said. The story of that day is the story of a world turned upside down, a reality rewritten. It began with cosmic signs that defied the laws of Naturian earthquake that broke the stones, a sky that went dark, a temple veil torn by an unseen hand. It moved to the impossible sight of saints rising from their graves, a testament to a power that had conquered death itself. It was confirmed by the confession of a hardened Roman soldier, the first enemy to bow before the crucified king. It was sealed in the unseen realms, where the powers of darkness were disarmed and the captives of hope were set free. And it culminated here, in a quiet garden, in the personal, intimate revelation to a weeping woman. The entire grand cosmic drama funneled down to this single point: Jesus is alive. The last breath of Jesus on the cross was not an end. It was the trigger for a chain reaction that shattered the old world and gave birth to a new one. The tomb was not a final resting place, but a womb from which a new creation emerged. The silence of the Sabbath was not the silence of defeat, but the quiet, powerful gestation of eternal life. From the terror of the guards to the confusion of the priests, from the grief of the disciples to the ecstasy of Mary, every event of those 3 days testifies to a single, immutable truth. The man they crucified was not merely a teacher or a prophet. He was and is the Son of God, the Lord of life, the victor over death. His sacrifice was not a tragedy, but the greatest act of love in history, a love that tore the veil, shook the earth, emptied the grave, and opened the way for every single person to be reconciled to God. The price has been paid. The door has been opened. And the invitation, first whispered to a weeping woman in a garden, still echoes through the ages to every heart that will listen.